Hey, it's Adam. Today I thought I would do a care guide on Philodendron Micans. This Micans was my very first velvet leaf philodendron, and I grew this entire plant from cuttings. It only took less than a year for this whole plant to grow from one cutting. I'm obsessed with Philodendron Micans because not only are they easy to grow, but also the leaves just look amazing. They're kind of they start off orangey and then they fade to this dark deep green. They're also really velvety, so they're fun to I don't know, feel. And then on the back they are this dark purple. Yeah, all the back leaves on the back are dark purple, so that also adds a nice pop of color when you're looking at the plant from different angles. And also in the sun, you can see that the leaves are shimmery, and yeah, they're just super nice, especially up close when you see it, and especially also in person. This plant looks 10 times better in person. It definitely adds a unique pop of color to your collection instead of just having plain green plants all around. It's definitely, I think everyone should have at least one Micans in their collection because it adds a nice dark foliage color and orangey new leaves and texture as well because they are velvet. So yeah, I think every collection needs a Micans. The Philodendron Micans is easy to grow, and it's also, I find it easier than the regular heartleaf philodendrons to grow, which is strange. I don't know if it's just me or if it's a universal experience, but my Micans has been easier to grow than the regular green heartleaf philodendron, the Philodendron Brazil, and lemon lime philodendron, the heartleaf one. They actually are easy to grow, but they're just not as vigorous and fast growing as the Philodendron Micans, as well as easy to grow. So I definitely recommend Philodendron Micans for easy to grow and fast growing. So if you're looking for something different to add to your collection, maybe you want to add some velvet leaf philodendrons to your collection and you want to start with something easy and cheap, I would 100% recommend starting with a Philodendron Micans. Before I start off any plant care guide, I always like to think about where the plant is originally found because it just helps when you're picturing its native habitat. It helps you visualize the care that it's going to need and the conditions that it would be receiving if it was still in the wild. So Micans is part of the Araceae family, and it's commonly found, or it's native to, the Caribbean islands of Dominica and Tobago. You can find them growing in the forests and the jungles there with high humidity, and they usually climb to tree trunks, which is why mine is climbing. They usually climb up tree trunks, and that's just how they grow naturally. So when we visualize these conditions and where this plant is found in its habitat, it will help us when we talk about the care later on in the video. Okay, so before we talk about care, I wanted to cover availability because at one point this plant was super expensive, but now the prices have definitely reduced. This plant is becoming more common, but it was once called rare. It's now December 2021, but back in February of 2021, I got this Philodendron Micans cuttings, and they were going for, I think, $20 for a one-leaf cutting, and a 4-inch pot would be $40 to $50. And if you have a lush pot kind of like this, I would definitely say anywhere from $80 to over $100. So yeah, the price was just crazy. I think that growers are mass producing these now, and people are taking cuttings and selling them on Facebook Marketplace, so it's becoming more common, and that's what has brought the price down drastically. So yeah, now one leaf cuttings are no longer $20. You can probably get a full pot of Micans for $15 to $20, and not a full pot, but a 4-inch pot of cuttings. And yeah, the prices have definitely dropped, and I think they're going to drop even more because everyone's realizing how easy to care for this plant is, and how easy it is to propagate as well. So growers are mass producing them, and people are selling cuttings on Facebook Marketplace every day. So yeah, it's becoming way more common. I would now call this plant an uncommon plant because it's definitely not as common as the pothos or the spider plant, but it's not rare at all. So yeah, I'm going to insert a photo of what this plant looked like when I first got it back in February of 2021. Here's a photo. I got this from my Instagram, and it's at Adam from Garden of Eden, or you can find a link to it in the description. But basically, that's what this plant looked like, similar to when I first got it. I actually think I got it in, I do remember it being January, but that photo was February, so around that time. But it had 2 leaves, and then in that photo it grew 2 more. So yeah, it had 4 leaves back in February, probably 2 leaves in January, and now, not even a year later, almost a year, it's this huge pot of Micans, and it probably would be even bigger if I had not been cutting it from the top. So I actually got that original cutting through a trade. She had them listed. It was a 2-leaf cutting, and she had it listed at, I think it was 20 or 25, but I traded her with a few other plants. So I ended up getting that cutting, and then later on a plant friend gave me some other cuttings, and I combined them and I just made this full pot of micans. I have a TikTok about when I cut up the original cutting, and I will put a short clip of it here, but my TikTok is the same as my Instagram, and it's also linked in the description if you wanted to go check that out. That video was taken around May of 2021. So May is when I chopped up the original one cutting I had into smaller cuttings, and then I'd say I potted them up around June. So June, July, August, September, October, November, December. So 6 months, within 6 months, those 5 or 6 cuttings that I potted are now this huge plant. So you can tell it's super fast growing. I've also been considering extending the pole, but I kind of like how I can just take propagations of this plant whenever I want. But yeah, it would be a lot taller. I just like the size it's at now, and I like how I can continue taking cuttings whenever I want. I always have micans cuttings around. I have them I have some in bottles right here. I have like a small pot of Philodendron Micans. Once you have a micans and it's growing and you're taking cuttings, you'll always have cuttings to spare. Okay, now let's get into the actual care of this plant. So if we think back to the conditions it's receiving in its natural habitat, which we were talking about at the beginning of the video, if you picture the lighting it's receiving, it's underneath trees growing on tree trunks, right? So there's a thick canopy of trees on top, and it's not actually receiving direct sun like how a cactus would in nature. It's receiving like bright indirect sun and underneath the tree, so like dappled sunlight. And so I would imagine only like the top vines that reach near the top of the trees are actually receiving any sort of direct sunlight. Just it needs bright indirect light all day. For example, right now from this window, it's receiving like this bright light, but there's no direct sun rays on it. So if it gets this type of light like all day, it's going to be completely fine. Let me open the window. You can see it's now getting direct sun rays on it. A few hours of direct sun like this is definitely not going to harm the plant. If anything, it's going to be helpful to the plant, especially in winter. But where I used to have this, it was getting 3 or 4 hours of this direct sun on it, and it had no problems. But now I'm in a different room, and if I move the plant, it's actually sitting like back here. So it's not really getting any direct sun rays on it. It's just getting that bright light far from the window, and it's growing perfectly fine. But you also don't want to like shove it in a super dark corner where there's basically no light. So yeah, don't let it like bake and cook in direct sunlight, but don't also put it in a dark corner. Somewhere in the middle, it will be happy. And either way, it's always going to grow for you because, yeah, I've had it in all sorts of light and it's always been growing. The only thing I'll say is that if it's in super low light, you won't get as deep color leaves. You'll get kind of more green and you'll lose the velvetyness to them. And also they won't grow as fast. And then in direct sun, it probably, like direct sun, I'm talking about like 6 to 8 hours, it would probably end up burning, but I've never had a burning problem. So keep it somewhere in the middle. Okay, so now we're going to talk about watering for the Philodendron Micans, and I've noticed, and a lot of other people are also saying that Micans does not like to dry out completely as you would with other philodendrons, and I think it's just because it has thinner roots. So if you let it go bone dry, those thin roots dry out and they die, and then if you water it, then you're watering dead roots, and then you're going to cause rot. But then if you overwater your micans, you're also going to cause rot. So you just need to be in the middle. For some of my other philodendrons, I let the leaves curl and then they tell me that they need water. But for the micans, I water it just before it would even begin to curl. So my general guideline for watering is to just let the top inch of soil dry out. And people say that, but you really need to test. You need to put your finger in the soil. And if you're noticing that the first top inch of soil is dry, then you need to water it, and if you're noticing that's a little bit moist, then you don't need to water it. So yeah, just kind of be in the middle for watering and in the middle for lighting as well. But if you give it a little bit less or too much of each thing, it'll probably bounce back because it's just such a carefree plant. If you're ever in doubt and you're about to water your micans and you're like, I don't know if this is like the right time, I don't want to overwater, but I also don't want to like underwater it, I would just say wait one more day. It's usually not going to do any harm to it, and it would be better than overwatering. Okay, so next I'm going to cover fertilizing, and this is one that I like to constantly keep fertilized throughout the year because it's always growing. Plants that are growing fast usually use up a lot of nutrients, so you need to supplement that. And so I like to give it frequent light doses of fertilizing. I try to do every time I water, but if I forget 1 or 2 times, it doesn't really matter. So I can't really give a guideline for that because it depends on which fertilizer you're using. So just read the label on the back and cut it in half, and then you'll have a very diluted fertilizer solution, and just fertilize it whenever you remember, and it'll probably enjoy that and grow a lot faster. As for the fertilizer I use like a really basic all-purpose houseplant fertilizer, and it works perfectly fine. If you want, you can use something organic. It might be better for the environment, but I just have one that I've had for years, so I'm trying to use that up. So now I'm going to talk about repotting and soil. I have my micans in a clay pot, and I also had it in plastic before. Both times it did well. I just like the look of clay personally, and also if you're in overwater, it helps because the clay is porous, so you will most likely reduce overwatering. But if you're in underwater and you like to let your plants get bone dry and you don't water them for like a month, I would definitely recommend using plastic because clay will just add to how dry it gets. For soil, they are found on the forest floor, right? So the first few feet of soil, I'd say, is like debris mostly because there's constantly leaves falling and animals that are digging, and so the soil's really loose and fluffy, and there's like kind of stuff in it, like leaves and other like plant materials, and probably rocks as well. So they do like an airy soil mixture. I like to use just regular all-purpose potting soil, but I do like to add extra perlite if I have that on hand, and then sometimes I add bark chips as well. I do have some in here. If you don't, try adding a little bit extra perlite, but it's better than not doing anything, because if you just pot it in a really soggy, like heavy potting mixture, then not only will you be like more likely to overwater, but also the roots can't breathe, and they are found in that airy soil from the forest floor, right? So you do want to make sure that you are adding something that will aerate soil a little bit. And you usually repot Philodendron Micans when it's really root bound. So mine has like some roots coming out the bottom of the pot, but it's still growing, and if it was like severely root bound, it would probably not be growing. It would be like struggling because there's no more room in the pot. So that's probably the point where I will be repotting this, and I'll just go like an inch or two bigger because they do like to stay a little bit root bound. But definitely don't overpot your plant because you're gonna have a small root ball in a huge massive pot, and then you're gonna rot that root ball. So I'm guessing this will be due for its repot in spring of 2022, which I will film a video on doing if it does end up needing it. But I'm gonna pop out the plant, and if I see roots circling the pot a lot and it's not really like growing like how it always usually is, then that's the point where I will be repotting it. So yeah, if you're ever unsure about potting, always keep it underpotted because they most likely will enjoy being more root bound. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about staking for the Philodendron Micans. So basically, as I said, they do, or they are found growing up tree trunks, but you can also let them trail in your home, kind of like in a hanging basket. I've always grown my Micans climbing, so I don't know what they're like trailing, but apparently they do get smaller and smaller leaves because there's nothing to grab onto, so the leaves just get smaller, I guess. Yeah, I don't know because I've always had mine climbing, but for my other Hartley philodendrons, I can say that the leaves do get smaller. It just depends how you want to grow it. If you don't mind the smaller leaf look, that's completely fine. But if, like, the reason why I have mine climbing is because it's always, since it was that small cutting, it's always been shooting upwards and pointing upwards, and so like it just has more of a like will to climb rather than my other Hartley philodendrons. I noticed that they like kind of vine down a little bit, and then they kind of point upwards, but then they continue vining down. So I let them do what they want. For the Micans, it was pointing straight up. I decided to put in a little stake, and then when I chopped it up in that little TikTok I showed you earlier, I ended up just putting something like a structure. So I put this moss pole in. If you get a self-watering moss pole, that's definitely better. If you get this type of moss pole where it's literally just sphagnum moss in a net and you're not keeping it moist, then it's not really doing much. You could be using like a stake, or I've seen people use wood planks. So you can basically use anything that the plant will attach to. But if you get the chance to get a self-watering moss pole, I would definitely try that. Or if you have one of these regular ones and you're willing to make sure that it's never going to dry out, which is very difficult, you can do either way. Regardless of if I'm keeping this moist or not, the Micans is still climbing up it, and so I'm just going to continue letting it climb. I also like the look of it climbing, but maybe eventually one day I'll have a separate pot of my Micans and I'll let it trail and see how that grows. So yeah, if it looks like it wants a support, put in a trellis, a bamboo stake, a moss pole. And if you're noticing that you want it to trail, or if it's beginning to trail down and you like how that looks, then you can just put it in a hanging basket and let it trail. Okay, so lastly, I wanted to cover pests and disease. For the pests, it really just depends what you end up getting if you get pests. I've never had a pest in my Micans, and if it does get a pest, it's usually because you had another plant that was infested and you kept them next to each other. But it's not really prone to anything, I don't think, because mine's never had an issue. and I don't really hear a lot of people saying that theirs are prone to anything. So yeah, it's usually like a carefree plant. If you do end up with pests on your plant, you're just gonna wanna treat it depending on that pest. So it really depends because there's so many out there. Just search up what pest you think you have, and search up how to eradicate that pest, and that should help. And then as far as diseases, I haven't noticed that it's prone to anything either. The one thing I might say is that it has like these weird spots on the leaves. I don't know if you can see, but it gets these like spots on the leaves, and I don't know what that's caused from. It's not much of a big deal. I don't really care about it anymore. I barely notice it because I'm so used to it now, but it gets these spots and I don't really know what they are. But the plant's still healthy, so. Right, and as I was editing the video, I realized I did not really talk much about Micans propagation. I said how easy it was, but I didn't talk about how to do that. So basically, you want to make sure each cutting has at least one node, which is basically just that bump there, and you can see all those like roots that are ready to sprout. So if you're taking a top cutting, basically just chop around here, and as long as this part is underneath some water or maybe even moss or even soil, then it will root and you'll have a separate plant. And then if you go further down along the stem and your Micans already has these aerial roots, then you can just pop those in water maybe and let them grow out a little bit more, and then plant them in any substrate of your choice, and it should root very fast. They are so easy to propagate. As an example of a Micans propagation that I did a few days ago, I just popped it in water, the aerial root began growing, and it's a top cutting, so it already has a growth point. And here's a mid cutting, so basically this has already started rooting, and the node will pop out a new shoot, and that will continue growing. And also anywhere where you cut the plant, it will send out another shoot as well. I put directly in moss and they ended up just rooting right directly into the moss. There's a few roots here, and I saw some coming out the bottom. So yeah, they will pretty much root very easily in whatever you put it in. So that's pretty much all the tips that I have for Philodendron Micans. This is how I care for mine. It might be a little bit different depending on where you live and how you care for your plants, but that's a general just care guide on Philodendron Micans. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope this inspires you to get Philodendron Micans, because I 100% recommend this plant. It's super easy for beginners, and I think everyone should have one in their collection. That's all, and thanks for tuning in.